Hello and welcome to the CX Files podcast. I'm your host, Mark Hillary. Simon Dillsworth is the Managing Director for Consulting at Ember Group, based in the UK. Ember Group recently published a research paper on the opportunities around a combination of CX and the gig economy. Analysts are already calling this GigCX. Now that the work-from-home CX operating model has been proven, many are asking if it's possible to create a more flexible working environment for the agents that are working remotely. I called Simon to ask about his recent research and the work that Ember Group is doing with clients focusing on GigCX. Okay, Simon, great to have you on the podcast. Now, we're talking about GigCX and the gig economy. And, quite often gig economy gets a bad press because we know it's flexible for the workers and for the companies that hire the workers. But, often we see flexible just means lower paid. So why is there suddenly so much attention on gig workers inside CX and the CX marketplace in general?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. It's good to see you again, Mike, and good to be speaking on the CX Files again. I think it's fair to say that COVID-19 has provided a shot in the arm for flexible working options in general. We can look at the explosion of interest in remote working as a parallel example. I've been working within the CX industry for over 20 years now. And until recently, remote working has often been given short shrift based on perceived challenges relating to staff engagement, performance and management, training, and almost overnight, where many have now been forced to look at remote working in some way, shape or another. Those long-held assumptions are being challenged. So productivity can be maintained, and in many cases, it's got better. Training can be delivered effectively, given the advances in technology. And staff themselves are driving an increased preference for flexible working, as they see opportunities to drive a better work-life balance. So GigCX similarly is not new and has suffered from some of the misconceptions you've mentioned. And we've been researching this space for almost 2 years now and recently commissioned the GigCX 2020 Customer Service Report in partnership with Limitless Technology. And the findings highlight some really interesting stats that I think underline the increasing profile of this space. So I'll share a few of those with you. When we look at the split in gender, it was roughly 50-50 between male and female, so 55 male and 45% female. 72% of respondents held an undergraduate degree or greater, and 42% of those were in management roles or above. 85% of respondents were operating in service roles already, so classic roles in IT, operations, sales, but the largest contributing bucket there was customer service for 26%. The respondents came from over 21 countries, covering 42 languages. And really interestingly, 52% of respondents were in full-time or part-time work already, suggesting that gig is being used to supplement income. So I think when you start to look at those stats, it really brings to life the fact that this isn't about low-paid work and 0 hours contracts, which a lot of the negative press has led you to believe. This is increasingly becoming almost a lifestyle choice, with highly intelligent, skilled resources making the conscious decision to work in this space. I think some of the recent press relating to zero contract hours workers, certainly with Uber and Deliveroo, hasn't helped. But I think the shift overall and the increasing prominence of GigCX can be attributed to two key drivers. Firstly is the COVID disruption. So whether we'd like to or not, it's accelerated the need for brands to reevaluate their operating models. Digital transformation has been driving this to varying extents already. But no one could foresee an environment where all of a sudden entire buildings and regions would be locked down. So business models are being challenged, particularly ones that have been historically based on growth through lighting up of new sites and constantly adding new contact centers. And then I think in parallel to that, you've got the increasing role of personalization. And I don't mean personalization in the true sense where we talk about customers and how they want services delivered. Looking at this more from the employee or the workforce perspective. Generation Z are already digitally native and they expect to be able to work on their own terms and to be able to have some control over their pay and hours. But alongside that, you've got the older generation that are living for longer. The well-publicized challenges around the pensions crisis and people needing to find income to supplement themselves in later lives. All of a sudden, you've got a highly skilled workforce that is looking for means of supplementing their income. And what better way to do it than using your existing skills in a relatively light touch manner and to be paid for it. So I think there's lots of evidence points in the market that tell us that GigCX has certainly increased in prominence, and more brands are actively looking at it as an option for their care estates.
Yeah, and it's interesting how COVID has been a kind of catalyst by forcing everybody to work at home. Suddenly it's become possible to explore this area. But it's interesting that I've only really heard very recently about the major customer service companies exploring this. Concentrix started last year, they launched their Solve solution, but I haven't seen any of the other majors really embracing this yet. Are they behind the curve?
I believe so, but I'm also not surprised, because purely at a technology level, you could argue that a primary goal for any contact center company will be to ensure that it's managing its workforce through its existing technology platform. And all organizations will have some form of technology platform that they use to be able to manage the workforce. And in many cases, that technology is a result of multiple years of investment, and significant millions of dollars or pounds has gone into that. And I think certainly during the last 5 to 10 years, a lot of the companies have already been tinkering with home working. So they're already looking at how home working might fit as part of that technology stack. So the sudden shift towards accelerating home working is less disruptive, because it's really doing more of what a lot of companies have already been looking at over a number of period of years. But with GigCX, it perhaps is slightly more disruptive, because typically it exists via a standalone technology platform or partner. It isn't ready-made integrated into existing contact center company technology platforms. So you can probably see why there's probably a slower uptake as to why GigCX isn't being automatically offered by these companies.
Yeah, because you're talking there about the problem of the platform. And I know that recently LiveExchange, the founder of LiveExchange, was on this podcast, and he was offering a cloud-based virtual contact center that's then staffed entirely by gig workers. So effectively, the companies that would outsource their customer service to a BPO, they can now just buy access to this platform and then, embrace the use of gig workers. I mean, are you seeing anybody really adopt this approach rather than actually working with a customer service expert?
I think it's a really interesting model, Mark, and one that makes sense in an environment where pressure on operating costs has gone through the roof, and brands are constantly seeking guidance from the market as to how do you optimize your costs whilst delivering the flexibility of service and quality that's required. But I think some of the world's leading brands have already embraced GigCX at scale, and we can talk about companies like Amazon and eBay that are already embracing GigCX as part of a balanced estate. So it's not the answer to all problems. It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. But the fact that companies of that stature have already investigated this space and identified it as a critical ongoing component of their provision going forward tells you that there's something in this. And I don't think it's something that brands can ignore per se. And I think alongside that, the market has been disrupted aggressively in the last 10 years in particular. You think about products like Amazon Connect, where all of a sudden you can activate or white label your own contact center platform within hours. And alongside that, you've got long-established companies who've been working within the remote working space that can give you access to remote workers, again, within a matter of hours. So we're in an environment now where costs are under pressure. The ability to fire up your own contact center has never been, I wouldn't say easier, but more accessible. And there are more options for how you can access human talent to be able to manage customer interactions. So when you put all of those together, it's not really a surprise that companies like LiveExchange are looking at that model, because I think it's an inevitable shift and will continue.
Yeah, and I know that you guys at Ember have built a GigCX Accelerator. So, I mean, in addition to what you've already said about the opportunities, you clearly think that this is going to be a big opportunity in the industry. I mean, what are you doing with the accelerator?
Yeah, it's one of the reasons for our success in the CX market has been our focus on tangible, practical solutions. So we mentioned that we've been doing research into the GigCX space for 18 to 24 months now. And that's culminated in the GigCX customer service report I mentioned earlier. But one of the biggest challenges that we are finding clients are facing as they're looking to embrace this is just being faced with the plethora of different options. So if we consider that most brands are having to evaluate their operating models as a result of COVID-19, and before them, they've got a range of options. They can look at automation, they can look at outsourcing relationships, they can look at insourcing relationships, they can look at remote working, and then they've got GigCX. And I guess the obvious question is, well, where do you start and how do you decide what's most relevant for you and your brand? And at Ember, we strongly believe that the key to this is being able to isolate what it is you're trying to do and test and validate in a structured manner that allows you to take action quickly. So we've come up with the GigCX Accelerator, and it takes away some of the key challenges that we have found from clients when we've talked to them, namely inability to establish ownership within the organization. So again, you think about all the initiatives you're faced with, trying to get ownership and support consistently for initiatives can be a challenge. Secondly, is being able to analyze a suitable testing market. So once you've identified the market, being able to pull together the data inputs you need to be able to validate a high-level business case. Then there's the heavy lifting of running a pilot. So physically running an end-to-end pilot where you can test the concept of GigCX within a target market in a controlled manner. And then there's the provision of the results, which is quite simply taking you from thinking about GigCX through to running an effective pilot, through to presenting the results, which will be a business case that will either inform a decision to proceed or not. Because, as I said, this won't necessarily be for everyone, but you'll never get to the bottom of that if you're unable to test and validate in a structured manner. And we do this similarly for automation, we do it for outsourcing, and we do it for home working. But we've applied the same principles to GigCX because ultimately all brands want to answer the question, which is, how is this relevant to my business and what's the potential?
Yeah, and it seems that, the work from home model that you mentioned, it's now been clearly proven. There were all these barriers to use it before COVID, but this became a kind of catalyst. It forced people to adopt work from home. It's been proven to be safe and secure. And it seems that the GigCX is like the next step. It's like a refinement of the work from home model with like a change in the way that we hire people and paying them by transaction rather than, a salary for an 8-hour day. Would you say that it is like a continuation? We're looking at one change following another.
I think it's related, but I think it's worth looking at GigCX in isolation. I think it deserves its own seat at the table because it is remote working, but I think GigCX is capitalizing on, as I said, the changing nature of work, the changing preferences that people have for how they want to work, and also that this is increasingly being delivered in a more socially responsible manner. So, for example, there are companies out in the space now that sign up to the Good Gig practice, which in a nutshell is making sure that people are rewarded fairly for the job that they do, that they're not put under undue pressure to work to shifts or to service levels. They provide their skills on a basis that is acceptable to themselves. And they are treated fairly in line with sort of freelancing legislations that are relevant to whichever region in the world they're working in. So all of those factors combined have elevated this as an option. And if the workforce is increasingly demanding this as a choice, the business world will have little choice but to respond and to make it available to increasing levels. But I think where you can potentially differentiate with home working, and it's maybe a tenuous one, but it's a potential for GigCX to do much more than just care. And there's often a misconception that this is about having people asking customer service queries and little else. But you've got huge opportunities with GigCX. It's care, it could be sales, it could be advocacy, it could be coaching. And we all know that customers love talking to other customers when it comes to making decisions around products or services. There's an inbuilt trust at being able to speak to other people that have used a brand or used a product or used a service. So when you start to look at the broader potential of GigCX, I think it elevates it beyond simply a flexible or remote working operation. It has a strategic focus, which, if it's harnessed, can be exceptionally powerful and is evidenced by the fact, as I said, there are some seriously successful companies globally who are using this at scale as we speak.
Yeah, and I know that it's something that's only just been in the news today. But it's TUI has just announced they're closing a whole load of travel agents across the UK and Ireland. But what was buried deep in the news, far away from the headlines, was that they're actually switching almost all of the affected people into a work from home model to do travel sales. And I thought that was just very interesting. The headline, it looks as if, the high street's collapsing and travel agents are all closing. But it seems that, you can actually just completely change the business model and put these people into probably, paid by results kind of work that's work from home.
Absolutely, and there's a great phrase that was coined by Aileen Elkins, who's ex-Microsoft Global VP of Care, and she talked about a portfolio career. And I think we're going to see more and more of this because particularly with Generation Z and the way in which they are thinking about the world and the world of work, and we think about the older generation who are looking to supplement their incomes, the ability to de-risk your income stream by working on multiple gigs, I think is going to be an increasing preference because it's about skills and knowledge, and you don't have to physically go into an office to be able to impart that skill and knowledge with either your employees and co-workers or customers. As long as the customer can reach you and they can have the sort of engagement with you that they need to be able to resolve their issues, there's huge opportunities to leverage skills and expertise wherever it sits in the world. So I think it's an inevitable evolution of the world of work. I think GigCX offers a great opportunity to take advantage of that. And I come back to this concept of, employee personalization. This is being driven by the workforce as much as anything else. And COVID has accelerated that enlightened thinking. But the days of everybody being chained to a desk and commuting for 3 or 4 hours a day, I think are long gone. And we'll start to see a blended economy now as businesses realize that we've got to take into account how people want to work. And that may increasingly be by working across multiple gigs. It could be by being paid for performance because they've got enough gigs to be able to operate that sort of model. But it's challenging all of the preconceptions that we've typically worked with.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. Please take a moment to review the podcast because this helps other listeners to find it. And if you have any suggestions, then get in touch with me on Twitter or LinkedIn. I'm @Mark Hillary with 2 L's, or just search Google for Mark Hillary.